fluffy dice?
Yes, people, welcome back to the Knots Cave. Last time we took a look at the 5 worst games released for the Sega Saturn, as rated by the official magazine. And of course, we caused a little bit of controversy down here, didn't we? Yes. And with you guys on this one, Blazing Dragons did not deserve to be in the bottom 5. Come on, we've got games like Virtual Hydlide, Hardcore 4x4, just to name a couple of terrible games for the system. I'm sure you guys can name just as many more. I wasn't a fan of it myself, but yes, it didn't deserve to be in the bottom 5. So in no particular order this time, we're going to take a look at 4 first-person mech shooters for the system, starting with Psygnosis's Krazy Ivan. Yes, look at his eyes, guys. This guy's crazy. So let's take a look at Krazy Ivan. Yes. So the first mech shooter we have for the Sega Saturn is Krazy Ivan. Yes, crazy with a capital K, like Mortal Kombat. Yes. Developed by Psygnosis and Perfect Entertainment, Krazy Ivan was released for the Sega Saturn in 1997 and published by Perfect Entertainment. The official Sega Saturn Magazine reviewed the game in issue number 15, and the game received a respectable score of 75%. Krazy Ivan is a port of the PlayStation game which was released the year before in 1996. Here's what Sega Saturn Magazine had to say about the game.
Krazy Ivan isn't much more than a souped up version of that old arcade classic Battlezone. Fast and furious eventually, but gameplay that's slightly too simplistic prevents this from being the definitive Robo-Blast you might have hoped for.
Sadly, the Saturn box has no description on the back, so instead here's the one from the PlayStation box. You play as Krazy Ivan, a Russian soldier with a crazy mission, so leap into your 40-foot power suit and get ready to riot. Equipped with an outrageous armoury of weapons ranging from 30mm guns to the groundbreaking Tsunami Earthquake Generator, you'll be more than prepared for the crazy all-out blasting experience this side of the future. Yes.
Yes, I am mean. I'm bad. I'm terrible.
So yes, you play as Krazy Ivan, the mad Russian who, after being locked up for many years due to his previous crimes, was later freed in order to help the world tackle an alien invasion. Ivan jumps at the challenge and asks only for a 57 Chevy, some fluffy dice in return.
I've always wanted a 57 Chevy.
A Chevy?
With imitation leopard skin upholstery.
Very well.
And fluffy dice?
And fluffy dice?
Consider it done. Yes.
See what I mean? This guy's crazy, man. Just be warned, people, if you're not used to the way that pre-twin stick first-person shooters played in the 90s, you're going to have a little difficulty adjusting to the clunkiness of no analog control. Having said that, the button mapping for Krazy Ivan works serviceably well. It isn't perfect, and I found that switching the pitch and strafe controls around made things a lot easier. Strafe makes more sense when using the L and R triggers, and pitch up and down made perfect sense on Z and C. For some reason, by default, these are the opposite way around. Luckily, the game has many different layouts to choose from in the options screen, accommodating most playstyles. In Krazy Ivan, the aim of the game is incredibly simple. On each stage, your main objective is to defeat all of the enemy mechs. These show up on your mini-map radar as blue markers, and in some stages have more than a few of these to deal with. Once you've dealt with the enemy mechs, you have to make your way over to the shield generator, which is each stage's end boss. And trust me, it's exactly the same for each stage. Once you've defeated the shield generator, you can move on to the next stage. Don't be in such a rush to get to the shield generator at the end of the stage, or you'll miss out on the game's secondary objectives. In between each mech fight, the game's maps are littered with normal enemies that are ripe for the picking. Taking out these enemies enables Ivan to stock up on vital items such as ammunition, health and energy cores. Enemies also drop human hostages when defeated, so be on the lookout for as many of these hostages as possible. Hostages can also be collected from defeated bosses. The most important thing to look out for in between mashing mechs though is energy cores. These energy cores serve as the game's main form of currency and can be spent in the shop in between each mission to upgrade Ivan's Steel Cossack power suit. Avoid collecting the Schizo mode cores though, as they'll reverse all of Ivan's controls, which can seriously affect your ability to play. Providing you've collected enough energy cores by the end of each stage, you can upgrade Ivan's Steel Cossack with many new weapons in the game's shop. Purchase new guns, missile upgrades, specials, or even top up your health. These upgrades are all essential for the game's later stages, as Ivan's basic weapons will become more and more ineffective as you progress through the game. After each stage, you're given the option to select the next by scrolling left or right on the globe. Some of the later stages aren't accessible early on, but as the game only has 5 stages and 1 hidden boss fight, this isn't really much of an issue. Be careful not to spend too much time hunting for energy cores in between mech fights, as you only have at the best of times a limit of 2 to 4 minutes to find the next mech on the map and defeat him. So be mindful of this and make sure to maximise the short amount of time you get to find those energy cores. The timer does however freeze when you're fighting each mech battle and is subsequently replenished at the end of each fight, but if you do run out of time, a giant phantom steel Cossack appears and you have to keep damaging the giant until he retreats in order to refill the timer. Just beware of the giant Cossack's explosive attacks, it deals massive damage, especially if you get caught too close to him, and again, once defeated, you can return back to normal gameplay. The game's normal enemies are rather tame for the most part, and for the first few stages of the game are nothing more than just cannon fodder. But from around stage 3 onwards, the little buggers become increasingly more tricky to deal with and can come at you from a variety of different angles at the same time. You will often find yourself ducking and dodging around incoming enemy fire and constantly on the lookout for incoming airstrikes. The game can become truly chaotic at times, making for some fast-paced and rather intense gameplay. One of the game's normal enemies that I want to pick on in particular is this little swirly bladed flipping thing. I don't know what it's called and I can't tell you what it is, but it's a little that's what it is. Once this thing has you in its sights, the enemy will hunt you relentlessly and it's really quite difficult to land hits on. When this little git gets close enough, it can be a real pain to shake off, and sometimes the game decides to throw 2 or 3 of these at you at the same time. And from there, things can go south really fast, so be ever vigilant for these little buggers, in my eyes, the most annoying enemy in the game. Cheers, Mr. Swirly Thing. Yes. Each of Krazy Ivan's many giant mech bosses have their very own unique look and play styles, making for some quite memorable boss fights. For the first 2 stages, most of the mechs are relatively easy to defeat and pose no real threat to Ivan. But later into the game, it would pay you well to listen to the wise words of Katya, who comes over the comms before each fight. She will often reveal the boss's weakness or vulnerable points. The game does pause for a split second to load Katya's video message in, which does slow the pace of things down a little.
This arena is guarded by Colossus. He's big and mean, but if you keep low and move fast, you'll be able to take him out.
However, these videos can be switched off in the game's options screen. This makes the game flow a little better, but you do lose out on that little bit of exposition before each fight, and a little bit of the game's cheesy charm. Speaking of cheesy charm, the game has many FMV sequences between stages that reek of 90s cheese, and are so hilariously bad they're good to watch, people. Ivan himself comes across, quite frankly, very childish, making for some extremely cringeworthy and comedic moments between him and the many people he's trying to save around the world. I hope he gets that 57 Chevy with the fluffy dice that he so furiously desires, man.
Now the field is moving out towards Euro Disney.
What? They're going to waste Disneyland? No way. Let's go. Hold on, Mickey, I'm coming!
The game runs at a fairly stable frame rate for the most part, only with occasional bouts of slowdown. In the game's defence, this only occurs when the screen gets extremely chaotic, which predominantly happens during the final stages of the game. This isn't enough to be crippling to the gameplay in any way at all, but sadly in order to maintain the game's half-decent frame rate, we're given a very poor draw distance, which sadly is probably one of the worst I've seen on the Saturn, and this does affect combat significantly, especially in the later stages of the game. Some of the flying enemies tend to clip out of view whilst relatively close to Ivan, making tracking some of them an absolute pain in the backside. Overall, Krazy Ivan is a fun and engaging, if somewhat short romp through a mech-infested planet Earth, which sadly just misses the mark of being a truly great game in my eyes. The lack of variety in the game's objectives and combat make each mission feel the same as the last, and sadly with the game only having 5 missions, this isn't a good thing. The gameplay is fast and chaotic at times, which is great fun and really engaging, but sadly it's all over way too soon, and after a few playthroughs you will completely have had enough of this game. With a few more stages and maybe some extra missions and a multiplayer mode, this could have been a really great game for the Sega Saturn. Instead, sadly, we get a game that's just average at best. So yes, there we go, Krazy Ivan. Not quite as good as the PlayStation version, but still a serviceable port of the game. It's playable enough, but we expected better. So anyway, the second game we're going to plonk into the Sega Saturn is Ghen War, another first-person mech shooter. Let's hope there's an improvement on Krazy Ivan. So next up we have Ghen War, another first-person mech shooter, this time developed by Jumping Jack Studios and Sega's Away team, and published in 1996 by Virgin Interactive. Sega Saturn Magazine gave the game a very pleasant review score of 78% in issue number 9, and had this to say about the game.
Far from being innovating and lacking the kind of thrills that make a game a classic, Ghen War still manages to qualify as a fun shoot 'em up. Fans of Doom-style action may be silenced for a while, at least.
The back of the box reads as follows. Our solar system has been overrun by a strain of hostile enemies known as the Ghen. As a lieutenant, you are a surface engineer who is the sole remaining expert operator of a supercharged hypersuit. Your task is to rescue mankind from these evil invaders. Yes. In short, the humans and Ghen have been living peacefully together for years on planet Earth after the Ghen sought refuge there from their bloody intergalactic war against the fearsome race known as the Bokyat. The Ghen helped humans with significant technological advancements over the years, the best of which was an implant which cured all forms of disease. You play as the Lieutenant on board a starship bound for Saturn's moon of Titan, where you're en route to rendezvous with the Sunstar, which is currently in orbit around Saturn's moon. Your fellow crewmates consist of Jenna, the ship's captain, Gina, the ship's pilot, Boxhead, the crew's android science officer, and finally Akira, who, well, I'm not exactly sure what Akira does, but he's there too. Meanwhile, from the surface of Titan, the Ghen launch a sneaky surprise attack against the orbiting Sunstar. Seconds later, the Ghen destroyed Titan using a strontium reactor, and our friends are caught up in the ensuing chaos. With news of the Ghen building more of these reactors on the surface of Mars, Jenna decides to head for the Red Planet in order to destroy the reactors before the Ghen have a chance to use them. And thus begins the Ghen War.
Return to the ship. We're going to Mars.
Ghen War's story is quite an entertaining one. I don't want to give too much away for anyone who may want to play through the game, but suffice to say, for a 90s game, the cutscenes are very well put together and the acting isn't half as cheesy as you'd expect. So in my eyes, the game is worth playing just to experience the story alone, but be warned people, Ghen Wars is not an easy game to finish. Each of Ghen War's stages displays the mission objective on the loading screen before the stage starts. You can recap on this at any time from the game's pause menu. There you can also check out the game's map to look for any unexplored areas you may have missed. Ghen War's mission objectives do vary from stage to stage, and it gives the game slightly more depth than Krazy Ivan had. These objectives can vary from simply eradicating the Ghen, or completing puzzles, and even demolishing Ghen structures. Your supercharged hypersuit comes fitted with a variety of weaponry, from homing rockets and mines to decoys and grenades. You really do have a lot of firepower at your disposal. Sadly, unlike the name suggests, the supercharged hypersuit moves rather slowly in game. It can run, it can jump, and it can hover. However, doing so rapidly drains your boost bar. On entering the game's first stage, the biggest thing you'll notice is that the heads-up display takes up a rather large portion of the game's display. The HUD is packed with all the vital information you need to survive, like shield, boost, energy and ammo levels, and also a mini-map. These are all really nicely incorporated into the HUD and doesn't interfere with the view as much as you'd think it would. The game's camera does have a very narrow field of view, which can make things feel quite claustrophobic at times. Couple this with the game's extremely short draw distance, which is only a little better than Krazy Ivan's was, but here the detail seems to trail off into complete darkness, making it quite easy to become lost in the more open stages. At points like this, the minimap becomes an essential tool for navigating your way through the darkness. Problems aside though, Ghen War chugs along at a mostly consistent 30 frames per second, even with multiple Ghen on screen, and trust me, things can get quite chaotic, so the low draw distance can be partially forgiven. The game does suffer from some slowdown, and at moments it can be quite jarring, but those moments are so few and far between it doesn't really affect the game a great deal. The basic control layout works well on the Saturn's controller, with the only real pains being one, you're limited to cycling one way through your weapons, which doesn't sound like too much of a chore, but later in the game you have so many weapons at your disposal it would have been nice to have a button to cycle back the opposite way. And secondly, the manual camera control is a real pain, as you have to stand still, hold the Y button and then use the D-pad to pan and scan your camera. To be honest, I didn't have to adjust the camera too much while I was playing, so it isn't worth worrying about too much, simply because the supercharged hypersuit's lasers tend to lock onto all enemies, and so do most of your rockets too, so using the camera isn't really essential. The combat in Ghen War is relatively rock solid, and the game throws plenty of different enemy types your way, with some of them being a lot more irritating than others. But be warned people, some of the levels have very tight corridors and corners, which isn't ideal for close quarters combat, so letting the Ghen get too close to you in these areas is ill advised. If they do get too close, it becomes a lot more difficult to target them in these tight areas, so never let the Ghen back you into a corner. Having said that though, you will also run into trouble in some of the more open stages if you don't keep an eye on the minimap, as it is easy to become surrounded by enemies hidden beyond the game's shoddy draw distance. Be very careful though, because even though you can't see the enemies, they can still see you and they will definitely still shoot at you, so using the minimap becomes essential in a lot of the open areas just for spotting enemies that are hidden beyond the draw distance of the game. Ghen Wars has more stages than Krazy Ivan's lousy 5 and plenty more variety to boot. Starting out on Venus, our friends then travel across to the Moon and after that Mars. Later in the game you'll return to Earth where you get to explore cityscapes and underground facilities too. As you progress through the game, of course the Ghen will come at you in greater and greater number and each time take more and more hits to take down. So be careful, Ghen Wars becomes incredibly tough, I'd say from the Moon missions onwards. With the game only giving you 3 lives and 0 continues, things can seem a little daunting at times. Extra lives are very scarce, and throughout my entire playthrough I only managed to find 1 or 2 of them, which makes progressing through the game at times painfully slow, as you will tend to die quite often. Sadly, the game's save file system doesn't really help things either. If you quit the game or restart a level at any point you will lose 1 life, and this even happens if you straight up power the Saturn off too. The only way you can safely quit out of the game without losing one of those precious lives is to wait until the end of each mission. This is the only time you can safely quit the game with 0 consequences. So a better implemented save system, a stage select, or even just a few extra continues would have helped this game immensely. Because once you run out of lives, the game just straight up deletes your save file, drops you back to the title screen, and you have to start the entire game all over again. So after trying to play the game 4 or 5 times, you can see where this is going to get really irritating. And I always got stuck about 2/3 of the way through the game on the second Australia level. This is where I always ended up losing all my lives and having to start again. So the best thing to do, people, yes, in situations like this, is to cheat, isn't it? Yes. So at any time during a mission, if you press and hold start, and while still holding start, press A, R, down, right, up, A and L. When you return to the game, you will have all the weapons, all the items, infinite ammo and infinite health for the remainder of that stage. Ghen Wars may have its flaws, but underneath the game does have a charm all of its own. Yes, it feels very overwhelming at times and it can feel claustrophobic even in open areas, but as you get used to the flow of the game and the rather simplistic controls, Ghen Wars really does begin to grow on you. Though not as fast paced as Krazy Ivan, Ghen Wars is still an entertaining and at times chaotic shooter. Overall, Ghen Wars is a good mech shooter that does have its flaws, but if you can just see past them, there's a decent game underneath. Just be warned people, this game does get exceptionally tough. So there we have it people, that was Ghen War. I did play that a lot when I was younger, and like I said, the game is punishingly difficult, so you've got to learn it and you've got to be on your toes as you're playing, otherwise you'll just end up like I did in the later stages of the game and just use cheats. Anyway, next up we have our third mech shooter for the Sega Saturn. This time we have the fantastic Gungriffon, people. Check this out, this game really is good. The third mech shooter game we have for the Saturn is the rather excellent Gungriffon. Gungriffon was developed by Game Arts and published by Sega for the Saturn in 1996. Sega Saturn Magazine reviewed the game in issue number 9, giving the game a very satisfying score of 88%. This is what Sega Saturn Magazine had to say.
One of the best robot games ever and an awesome shoot 'em up in its own right. Gungriffon deserves investigation by all bang-loving Saturn owners. Angry at the world? Why not step into your 30-foot robot and destroy your neighbours? Can't afford a robot? Then go down to the shops and have a look at Gungriffon.
The back of the box reads as follows. The Gungriffon armoured mechanoid is the most sophisticated military hardware yet to grace the battlefields of the 21st century. As a leading commander of the Asian Pacific Community's army, you control a devastating array of weapons in your bid to smash the enemy's defence and destroy their key strategic targets before time runs out. Gungriffon takes place in a grim, futuristic and dystopian planet Earth. The year is 2077 and the world is gripped in a truly global crisis. With global warming, food and energy crises running rife, political and economic conflicts at an all-time high, the world's countries have been split into 4 main regions: the Pan-European Union, the United American Countries, the Asia Pacific Community and the Organisation of African Unity. These 4 regions are constantly at war with one another, scrapping over the last of the world's dwindling resources. The majority of these battles take place in standard military equipment on land and in air, but things are about to change, people. You take on the role of a UAC pilot using the latest state-of-the-art mech technology, the High-Max Mechanised war machine. A sophisticated technology born to usher in a new age of warfare. The balance of the war lies in your skills as a pilot. You must pilot one of these sophisticated machines to ensure the UAC victory. Battles will take you from Kiev in the Ukraine to Lianyungang in China and beyond as you attempt to prevent global catastrophe. Now we've got the story synopsis out of the way, what can I say about this game? Ghen War really did an amazing job with Gungriffon. The game makes real good use of the Saturn's hardware and looks absolutely fantastic. Everything glides along at a consistently smooth frame rate, regardless of the amount of on-screen chaos taking place. But sadly, as with the vast majority of PAL Saturn releases, Gungriffon will play best at 60Hz as opposed to 50, because the game received absolutely no optimisations at all for PAL regions, so playing the game at 60Hz becomes essential to experience Gungriffon as originally intended. That aside, the draw distance is far better than most Saturn games, with trees and foliage detail appearing way off in the distance. The enemy mechs and scenery do tend to pop in a little closer to the camera, but it's hardly noticeable and doesn't hamper the gameplay in the slightest. Gungriffon's mechs appear incredibly well detailed, fearsome and chunky, with a level of detail not seen in any other mech shooter on the Saturn. Well, with the possible exception of the mechs in Virtual On, that is. The game's level geometry is very pleasing to the eye, with structures and terrain detail being some of the best I've seen in the Saturn to date. The ground and skybox work really well, making great use of the Saturn's VDP2. You really can tell how much love and hard work Ghen War have lavished upon this game, and it really stands head and shoulders above other Saturn titles released around the same time. You know, titles like the absolutely abysmal Shockwave Assault from Electronic Arts, which was funnily enough reviewed in the same issue.
We're being sent back. We'll have to keep doing it over until we get it right.
Before diving straight into the game, however, make sure that you've completed both of the game's training missions so you can fully get to grips with Gungriffon's control schemes and the way the game operates. Just jumping straight into the campaign can otherwise be quite daunting. Gungriffon is presented to you in first person, much the same as the other mech shooters we've played so far, but Gungriffon's HUD is by far the most well thought out and useful of the lot. The main HUD is full of useful detail. Text alerts pop up regarding enemies and mission updates, and the radar in the bottom corner shows you the location of nearby friends or foes. With constant chatter in the cockpit and battles breaking out all around you, the battlefield feels alive and believable, really immersing you in the Gungriffon experience.
Mission complete.
I won't lie to you here, Gungriffon is a vastly superior game when compared with the likes of Ghen War and Krazy Ivan. Gungriffon has a much more sensible, responsive and well thought out control scheme, especially from a time before dual analog control was a thing. The missions are very well put together and varied, if a little short in places, but each mission has a visual feel and style all of its own, giving the game plenty of graphical variety and making for some excellent looking levels. On the whole, Gungriffon's missions feel much more fleshed out and fresh compared to Krazy Ivan's just defeat the boss and Ghen War's get the thing and use the thing objectives. Gungriffon's missions have much more complexity and can go wrong in a variety of ways. This really pulls you into the game, making you feel much more involved in the game's narrative. One mission that really immersed me in the gameplay took place in the dead of night and required you to use the High-Max night vision mode. The effect that Ghen War's used here is really cool, and without it you can't see anything in the mission at all, and it's possibly one of my favourite levels in the entire game. Gungriffon's mission difficulty goes from piece of cake all the way up to insanely tough. It did take me quite a while to successfully get through the game's 7th mission in Weifang. In this mission you have to escort a convoy to the extraction zone and defend it along the way. This mission went south on me so many times, but always in a completely different way and to completely different circumstances. For me, this was the game's only difficulty spike, and after several retries, once I was familiar with the map and the enemy locations, I managed to pass the mission. But yes, the 7th mission for me was possibly the hardest one in the game. Initially, Gungriffon only has 4 stages to choose from, but as you progress, more stages open up to a total of 8 in all, plus the 2 training missions. This is possibly my only gripe with the game, is its length. It's a little on the short side and taking between 5 to 7 hours to complete depending on your skill level. But if you want more once the game is over, push up to the harder difficulties because that's where the game's real challenge resides. Gungriffon on the Saturn is simply a joy to play. The game is easy to pick up and extremely difficult to master, and even harder to put down once you've started playing. One of the Saturn's true gems. It's an exceptionally good Saturn game, only spared greatness by the low number of missions in total. But it's definitely a Saturn game that should be played by all Sega fans, a real look into what the hardware could do under an experienced development team. It's not necessarily a hidden gem for the Sega Saturn, just a massively underappreciated one. I know when I was younger this game flew completely under my radar, and I'm sure other Sega fans missed out on this one too. A real Saturn exclusive that deserves to be on the shelf of any Sega Saturn collector, an excellent piece of software. Gungriffon did receive a sequel that improves on the game in just about every single way, but sadly it was one of those games that stayed in Japan and never made it to our shores. Though after playing this I wouldn't mind getting hold of a copy myself just to check it out. So yes, there we go, that was Gungriffon, a game I never played when I was younger, and I'm now kicking myself because I didn't, because I think I found one of my new favourite games on the Sega Saturn. What an absolute joy that game is to play. I wonder if we can top that with the next game. I'm not sure we can, people, because that's probably one of the best games I've played on the Saturn in a very long time. So the final game we have today is a port of a PC classic. We have MechWarrior 2 for the Sega Saturn. It was a late release for the system, and I don't think, people, that we're going to be able to top Gungriffon in this video. So let's slap MechWarrior 2 in the Saturn and just see exactly what we get. So after the rather tasty Gungriffon, our next Sega Saturn mech masher is MechWarrior 2. Developed by Quantum Factory and published in 1997 by Activision, MechWarrior 2 31st Century Combat is a more arcadey take on the PC MechWarrior franchise. MechWarrior 2 was reviewed by Sega Saturn Magazine in issue number 20, where they gave it a very tasty score of 89%. Sega Saturn Magazine went on to say,
Digital Domain have produced a supremely satisfying strategy shoot 'em up, guaranteed to tax both your military mind and your itchy trigger finger. A challenging 3D shoot 'em up successfully bringing the PC game to the Saturn, but it is let down by the lack of multiplayer options.
The back of the box reads as follows. The year is 3057. Struggle for power fuels a society of warring clans. Bitter infighting perpetuates a universe of unrest. War is constant. Victory is temporary. Ceasefire is non-existent. A pause in the stream of salvos is only a signal to recalibrate crosshairs and redirect missiles. Time is scarce before the next unrelenting mission begins. For a mech warrior, war is life, and death is the only true peace. MechWarrior's main campaign gives you two different clans to choose from, Clan Wolf and Clan Jade Falcon. Both of MechWarrior 2's clans each have their own campaign mode containing 16 missions from the PC version of MechWarrior and plenty of extra Saturn exclusive missions on top of that. This gives MechWarrior 2 a stunning 48 missions to keep you busy and plenty of content to keep you coming back for more. The game's default control scheme isn't much different to Gungriffon, so it didn't take much getting used to. The only downside is that the default control scheme is missing some vital features, so I have some essential tips for first time players. In the game's option menu, change the default control scheme to 6, 7 or 8, as this gives you access to extra tools such as weapon zoom and torso twist. These are essential for not only finishing the training missions, but also offer a greater deal of control and manoeuvrability during combat. The combat in MechWarrior 2 isn't as straightforward as the previous games we've been playing. The enemy mechs can often at times completely surround you, and it can be very difficult to tackle them head on. The key to combat in MechWarrior 2 is circle strafing. Players of the original Doom on the PC will be well familiar with this technique. This is why enabling torso twist in a control setup is essential. Without this, the combat is very one-sided, so get used to circle strafing around the enemies as you fight, because in MechWarrior, circle strafing is the key to victory. Another great tip once you're used to circle strafing is to always go for the enemy mech's legs. Once you immobilise them, it makes them much easier to sneak up behind and just take them out really easily. Before each mission you can choose from a range of different mechs, each of which is suited to a variety of different combat situations. From the small but very nimble Kit Fox and Fire Moth to the heavily armoured and mighty but much slower direwolf. Be sure to choose your mech wisely before jumping into a mission, because each different mech has its own distinct stats and weapon loadouts. These loadouts can be customised for each mech, and you can also pair weapons together to make some brutal combinations. Be careful though, as overloading weapons can cause you to overheat in mid-battle, and your mech becomes a stationary target whilst your weapons cool down. A heavier mech is more suited to destruction and combat, but can be very slow to move. And a smaller mech, on the other hand, is great for missions that require quickly intercepting enemies or seek and destroy missions. Be careful though, as small mechs are exceptionally weak in combat situations and can only really survive 1 to 2 hits. MechWarrior 2 has by far the best variety of missions that we've seen in any game we've covered in this video so far. Missions ranging from destroying locations and identifying and destroying defective mechs, to intercepting fleeing targets and escorting or destroying convoys. The variety of missions on display here is absolutely phenomenal, and you never really tend to do the same mission type twice. Some of MechWarrior 2's more difficult missions do require a lot of trial and error, so it's always best to try experimenting with different mechs and different loadouts. This way you can maximise your advantage on the battlefield and help you find the best way around some of the game's more tricky missions. Every few missions or so, the game puts you into a ranking mission, with the odds stacked heavily against you more and more as the game progresses. If you can defeat the enemy mechs during these challenges, you will move up in rank, and if you're good enough you can make it all the way to clan leader status. Be warned though, some of the later ranking missions can be unbelievably tough to pass. The third Jade Falcon mission had me piloting the tiny Kit Fox mech with tinfoil armour against two of the game's beefiest and heavily armoured mechs, a Summoner and a Warhawk. Trust me, this is possibly the hardest mission in the game, and it took me many attempts to pass. We are running the PAL version of MechWarrior 2 here at 60Hz to get the game running at the correct speed. Sadly, only the game's audio was optimised to run correctly at 50Hz, and the rest of the game wasn't. So playing the PAL version at 60Hz makes the game's voiceovers cut out a little earlier than they should do, but other than that the rest of the game does play at the correct speed. For a Sega Saturn game, the visuals pack quite a punch. The game runs at a pretty much rock solid 30 frames per second for the most part, with only minimal slowdown at times, and even that's barely noticeable. The game engine makes use of the Saturn's Gurad shading, which makes everything look a little bit more grounded and believable. The draw distance is exceptionally good, with only minor things suffering from popping. This does work to your advantage, as you're then able to spot mechs and enemy targets at a safe distance, giving you the edge in most situations. Overall, MechWarrior 2 on the Saturn is a great mech blaster, with a massive amount of content to get through. A truly great game for the Sega Saturn, only just being beat in my opinion by Gungriffon, but still definitely worth checking out because it's one of the best mech shooters on the Sega Saturn. So there we go, people, that was MechWarrior 2. It's not quite Gungriffon, but wow, that game's packed with content. There's so much to do in there. It looks nice, it runs nice. Another good mech shooter for you Saturn fans out there, if that's what you fancy. So before we finish the video, Saturn fans, I've got a few more games I'd like to drop in as honourable mentions here at the end. One of those games is a mock for the Sega Saturn. The only reason I didn't include it in this video is because the game isn't presented in first person like the other mech shooters are, but a mock is a fantastic adventure mech shooting game. Honestly, we'll be covering this game in more detail in a later video as we look at the scavenger games that were released for the Sega Saturn. And one more game that we left off the list completely, simply because it didn't get translated into English at all, was Mobile Suit Gundam Side Story Part 1, 2 and 3. Oh my god, people, these are my favourite mech shooters on the system, and trust me, we'll be covering these in a later video too. So yes, there we go, people, 4 mech shooters that were released for the Sega Saturn. These games range from okay to amazing. I'm looking at you, Gungriffon. What a game, people. But talk to me in the comments, guys. Let me know what you think of these games. Let me know if you know of any other mech shooters that I may have missed. I'm pretty sure there's no more in the Power Library, but I'm sure there's quite a few that I've probably missed in the Japanese one. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video. Yes, I think.